So we've just found a really nice quiet location where we can review some of the images that we shot earlier at Badwater Basin. I'm going to start with this image. It's an image that I photographed with my macro. I wanted to make sure that I captured some of the details, not just the large scenes. It's rained heavily here in the past year, and all of these salt crystals are beginning to form again. I love the way that the yellow and the blue provide some color contrast between the salt that's actually building up and that's more low in the ground. So I'm just going to start by clicking on the auto. That's going to brighten up the image for me. I might take the whites up just a little bit more and maybe not darken down the blacks as much because it really is quite light out there in the basin. Now, I want to really make this look sharp. So I could apply texture, clarity, or dehaze to the whole image, but that's going to sharpen up everything in the background. And I like this shallow depth of field, so instead I'm going to choose my masking options. Now I can choose a brush, and let's get a large size brush, and then I can just start painting over the areas that I want to add this texture and this clarity in order to make this look sharper. I'll come down to Effects, add a little bit of texture, add a little bit of clarity. We could even go in and add a little bit of dehaze. See how that really makes it pop by darkening down those darker values. Then if I wanted to darken down, say, the edges in order to keep our eyes within the center of the image, I could do it with a post-crop vignette, but wouldn't it be nice if we could customize the vignette shape and size? We can do that with masking by just choosing the radial gradient, and then I'll just drag out a radial gradient. Now by default, everything within the radial gradient is going to be affected, and I want everything outside of it. So all we need to do is invert that, and then I'll return to light, and then just take down that exposure a little bit, and we can see that I can actually reposition that anywhere in the image that I want that spot of light. I'm just going to make it a little bit narrower, and then widen this out, and we can even rotate it to put that light at an angle. So very quickly, we've gone from before to after. I think a much more impactful image.
All right, once the sun was starting to set, I started to shoot a little bit wider. And in this image, I liked how the sun was still warming the mountains and causing the color contrast with the salt in the basin, which is now reflecting the blue of the sky in that shaded area. But I thought that the image was much more dramatic when I was there. So let's make a few quick adjustments to make this image match that feeling that I had while I was in Badwater Basin. I'll start with the crop tool, and I want to straighten the horizon, so I'll simply click on Auto. And if that doesn't straighten it, well, we can hold down the Command key on Mac or Control key on Windows, and we can drag with the Straighten tool across the horizon in order to straighten our image. All right, next I want to make some global edits, so I'll return to the Edit stack. I'll start in the light panel by setting my black points as well as my white points. I'm going to bring up my shadows and bring down my highlights so that we can see a little bit more detail back here at the very far end of the basin. And then I'm just going to bring up the exposure a wee bit. All right, then let's change to our masking tool so we can make some selective edits. And I'll start with the objects selection. I've got the option set to the rectangle, and I'll reposition the masks panel out of the way, and then just drag out over these yellow mountains. So Lightroom does an excellent job of selecting the top portion of the mountains, but it's missing a little area here. So with the Masks panel, I can add a secondary component by choosing Add and then selecting the brush, and I'll get a smaller brush and then click and hold down the Shift key in order to draw a straight line. Then we can just fill this area in here and start making our adjustments. So I want to make the mountains a little bit darker, so I'll bring the exposure down, although I think that the shadow areas are getting a little too dark, so let's bring up the shadow slider. Then I'm going to switch to the color panel, and I'm going to bring the temperature a little bit over to the right, making it a bit more yellow. And then I might use the hue to move to the left to add a little bit more red into those mountains. I think that's looking a little bit better. Now I want to darken the sky, so let's click on the plus icon and choose to select the sky. In the light panel, I'll just bring down the exposure a little bit. And I also want to shift the color, so I'll go to the color panel. I'm going to move the temperature slider a little bit to the left, and I'm also just going to desaturate that a bit more. All right, let's add a quick vignette. I'll return to the edit stack, come down to effects, and then bring the vignette in, give it a big feather, and then play a little bit with the roundness, maybe bringing it in towards the center and bringing the midpoint in a bit as well. All right, so very quickly we've gone from before to after, which is much more how I remembered the scene. Now, one of the things that I always try to do when I'm on location, if I'm looking one way and I've found myself a photograph, I'll always want to be sure when I'm finished that I'll turn around and look the other way. And sure enough, when I looked the other way, this is what I saw at Badwater Basin. So as the sun was setting, there were a few clouds and there was relatively high humidity for Death Valley. And we started to get a little bit of this atmospheric perspective where we could see a little bit of maybe mist or a little bit of dirt and sand and dust in the sky here at the top. Now, in order to accentuate this, well, first, let's make sure that we've got this level. So I'll use the crop tool and choose auto in order to level that horizon. Then I'm going to make my global edits with a light panel. So again, I'll take up my whites, bring down my blacks to add some contrast there. I might bring my shadows up a little bit, and I'll bring down my highlights. Now let's move to our masking tools. I'm going to select the linear gradient and then click and drag down into the image. Here, I'm going to use the color panel in order to warm this by moving the temperature more towards yellow. I'll also add a little bit of pink. And then in order to soften it, I'll scoot down to effects and move the clarity slider over to the left. So now I'm not seeing as much detail in the mountains, but we're seeing this really nice glow in this background area. All right, let's add a little spot of light in the foreground area here where this salt is. I'll click the plus icon on the mask panel and use the radial gradient, and I'll drag out a large radial gradient. What's going to be affected is the inside where it's red, so I'll move to the light panel and just increase the exposure a bit. Now I'll reposition this a little bit lower and maybe make it just a little bit smaller. But I'd like to darken down all of the edges around here. We could do that by using a post-crop vignette, or we can simply add another radial gradient. This time I will hold down the Command key on Mac, Control key on Windows, and double click. That will give me a radial gradient that's the same size as my canvas, and it automatically selects the outside to be affected. So now I can take down that exposure. I'm also just going to bring this out a little bit more and just maybe zoom out to make the edges a little bit softer. Excellent. I'll return to Fit in Window, and we can do a quick before and after. Now, the last image that I want to show you was taken a bit further up the basin in an area called Devil's Golf Course. It was taken as the sun was setting behind me, but I just love the color at the top of these salt structures. To me, they kind of look like the perfectly roasted marshmallow. So in order to make those browns kind of separate from the background, there's a few things we can do. The first thing is I'll start with the light panel, and let's just take the blacks down a little bit in order to add some contrast. Then I'll bring up the shadows, and I'm going to bring down my highlights. Then I'll want to switch to my masking. I'll grab my linear gradient and I'll click and drag from the horizon kind of down into this Devil's Golf Course area. And I'm going to use the color panel in order to take the sky far more towards blue and maybe a little bit towards green, kind of removing all of the yellow in the sky so that we have the contrast between the blue and then these warmer tones in the foreground. Now I'm also going to just desaturate that a bit because it's looking a little bit unrealistic. All right, I'll add a second mask, this time a radial gradient. Click and drag down here in the foreground, maybe reposition that a little bit higher, and then let's lighten that using the light panel and the exposure slider. All right, I'm going to bring that down and just restrict it to that area. Then I notice in the lower left-hand corner, we've got this distracting element. Let's go ahead and remove that. I'm going to zoom in, and then with the options set to just heal, let's see if we can get this to be removed. All right, excellent. That does a good job. So we can go ahead and zoom back out. And then to just darken down the sides, instead of adding a vignette, I'll return to masking and select the brush tool, get a very large brush, and set the flow down to maybe 30 or 40% and start just building up a little bit of the overlay on either side. Then I can go to the light panel and take down the exposure. And if I want to build up more of a darkening area, I can continue to paint. Here I'll go to the foreground and down in the corners there and right around here. Excellent. Let's do a little before and after. And I think you can see that very quickly we've gone from a much less to a much more impactful image.